You're deep in the wilderness, miles from civilization. The air is crisp, the sun filters through canopy, and the only sound should be the crunch of your boots on the trail. But then it happens. A sound that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, a noise that you know, deep in your gut, does not belong. This isn't the hoot of an owl or the snap of a twig. This is the sound of pure, unadulterated fear. We're diving into 7 disturbing true noises heard by hikers in the forest stories, and these accounts will make you think twice before stepping onto a remote trail alone. Prepare yourself. Our first account belongs to a man named Ethan Miller. Ethan is an experienced long-distance hiker, the kind of guy who finds peace in isolation and solitude. He was attempting a difficult 50-mile section of the Appalachian Trail in Maine, a notoriously rugged and sparsely populated area. It was late autumn, meaning fewer hikers, colder nights, and a forest that felt truly immense and empty. Ethan was confident, prepared, and carrying all the necessary gear to survive any standard situation. He had done this dozens of times before. 3 days into his trek, Ethan reached a dense, fog-covered ridge just as the sun was setting. He set up his tent quickly, grateful for the early dusk that promised a long, quiet night of rest. The fog was so thick it swallowed all light and sound, creating a perfect, oppressive silence. He was eating a dehydrated meal when he first heard it. Something subtle, almost dismissed as wind, but the air was absolutely still. The silence was the heaviest thing he had ever felt. The sound began as a low, throaty groan, an unnatural bass resonance that vibrated through the cold, damp ground. It wasn't the sound of an animal in pain, nor was it a falling tree. It was too sustained, too deliberate. Ethan froze, spoon halfway to his mouth, his heart slamming against his ribs. He instinctively reached for the large hunting knife he always kept secure beside his sleeping mat. The noise held, wavering slightly, sounding unnervingly close to a distorted human voice. He pulled out his headlamp, shining the powerful beam to the tent's mesh window and into the impenetrable fog. Nothing. The light simply dissolved a few feet away. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice sounding thin and panicked in the overwhelming silence. The low groan immediately stopped, replaced by a sound that was far worse, a series of quick, heavy thuds coming directly from the tree line, like something large was sprinting on 2 legs, circling his camp. "That wasn't a bear, I swear," Ethan later recounted, his voice still shaking when he told the story. The footsteps, heavy and rhythmic, moved entirely around his tent in a rapid, unnerving perimeter. He lay completely still, breathing shallowly, listening to the heavy pounding in the mist. The sound wasn't threatening him directly. It was marking him, checking the boundaries. It stopped abruptly, and the crushing silence returned. Ethan stayed awake, huddled in fear, waiting for the first light of dawn, knowing whatever made that noise was still out there, listening. Ethan finally saw the first streaks of daylight cut through the thick fog, painting the world in a cold, gray wash. He hadn't slept a wink. Every single muscle in his body was tense from the night-long siege of silence and anxiety. As the visibility increased slightly, he quickly packed his bag, moving with a desperate urgency he hadn't felt since his time in the military. He wanted off that ridge immediately, needing to get to lower ground where the forest was less dense. As he zipped up his pack, he heard the first noise of the morning, a sound that made his blood run cold all over again. It was a faint, high-pitched whistle, coming from the direction the heavy footsteps had disappeared into. The whistle wasn't melodic. It was sharp and piercing, the kind of sound a person makes to signal someone far away. He knew it was the same entity, and it sounded like it was being used as a signal or a warning. He felt profoundly exposed. Ethan didn't even bother cooking breakfast. He grabbed a protein bar and started hiking hard and fast down the trail, looking over his shoulder every 20 steps. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an eccentric hunter, or maybe he had just imagined the whole encounter because of exhaustion. But the terror felt too real, too visceral to simply be a product of his mind. He needed tangible proof or a clear explanation, and the woods offered neither. About an hour later, the sun broke fully through the clouds, and the day began to warm up slightly, easing the tension. Ethan stopped at a large boulder to finally catch his breath, feeling a small sense of relief as he put distance between himself and the ridge. However, as he leaned his backpack against the smooth face of the rock, his eyes caught something disturbing near the base of a massive ponderosa pine. There, deeply gouged into the thick bark of the ancient tree, were 3 parallel scratch marks. They were not random claw marks from a foraging bear. They were too long, too precise, and they started high, nearly 7 feet off the ground. These marks were clearly fresh, the pale wood underneath the dark bark exposed starkly against the trunk. Ethan, being 6 feet tall himself, knew whatever made those marks was enormous, easily capable of towering over him. The implications hit him like a physical blow. The heavy footsteps, the low groan, and now these towering, fresh scratches. Whatever he encountered wasn't just observing him. It was actively tracking him, capable of reaching terrifying heights. He didn't waste another second. Leaving the boulder behind, he pushed himself to hike at maximum speed, deciding to abandon the planned trail and bushwhack toward the nearest fire road, his peace shattered by the undeniable reality of what hides in the deep woods. Ethan's experience proves that some noises shatter the peace of the forest, replacing tranquility with primal fear. But sometimes the most disturbing sound is one that initially seems benign, even pitiful. Our second account features Sarah Jenkins, a wildlife photographer who was spending a week camped in the remote Redwood National Park, searching for elusive bird species. Sarah was a seasoned solo traveler, fully aware of the standard risks, but entirely unprepared for the auditory trap laid for her. Sarah had set up her camp far off the main tourist paths, tucked into a small, silent clearing surrounded by monolithic trees. The silence was profound, the kind that only the dense canopy of ancient redwoods can create. It was late afternoon, and she was reviewing her photos when the first sound came, a distinct, high-pitched sob. It sounded exactly like a young child crying, distressed and alone. Instantly, Sarah's professional focus dissolved, replaced by a surge of panic and concern. A lost child? Deep in these woods? It was an impossible, heartbreaking scenario. She grabbed her heavy-duty flashlight and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there? Can I help you?" The crying stopped immediately, replaced by a terrible, unnatural quiet that pressed down on her senses. A few minutes passed, and the silence began to feel like a heavy blanket. Just as Sarah started to doubt what she heard, the crying started again, this time slightly closer and even more frantic. It sounded genuinely desperate, the raw grief of a child calling for their parents. Sarah, driven by pure human instinct, started moving in the direction of the sound, navigating carefully through the uneven terrain. It felt wrong, she later admitted, describing a faint, metallic quality to the sound that her subconscious registered but her concern overruled. She paused at a large log, shining her beam into the dense shadows, and called out again, "Hold on, I'm coming to help." As she waited for a response, the sound abruptly shifted. It went from the distressed sobs of the child to a perfect, chilling imitation of her own voice, screaming her name. "Sarah, help me." The mimicry was flawless, yet fundamentally empty of human emotion, like a recording played back in the wrong environment. The sudden, personalized distress sent a jolt of ice down her spine, replacing her concern with pure, paralyzing terror. She knew then she was being deliberately lured deeper. Dropping all pretense of help, Sarah spun around and sprinted back toward her camp, the echoing call of her own voice ringing out unervingly through the colossal trees. Sarah burst back into her clearing, heart pounding a relentless rhythm against her ribs. She didn't bother trying to pack her tent or her elaborate camera equipment. Her only goal was to get to her truck, which was parked about a half-mile away at an old logging road access point. The imitation of her own voice still echoed in her memory, a psychological attack designed to exploit her deepest fear, vulnerability and isolation. As she scrambled to secure her essential survival kit, water, satellite phone, car keys, she heard the sound again. This time, it wasn't a desperate plea. It was a guttural, wet snort followed by a slow, dragging sound in the underbrush, circling the perimeter of her camp, much like Ethan's experience. The shift from intelligent, deceptive mimicry to this raw, animalistic sound was horrifyingly intentional, designed to terrify her. She snatched up her bear spray and, without looking back, plunged into the dense woods, heading straight for the logging road. She ran blind, ignoring the low-hanging branches and the uneven terrain. She knew that whatever was out there, it was intelligent enough to use sound as a weapon and physically large enough to create the awful, heavy dragging noise she now heard accelerating behind her. It felt like I was running from pure malice, she recalled. The dragging sound stopped abruptly. Sarah, seizing the momentary silence, dove behind a massive, moss-covered redwood, trying to regulate her ragged breathing. She waited, rigid, listening for any sign of movement. The forest was dead silent again, but this time, the silence was aggressive, loaded with hidden menace. She knew it was nearby, waiting for her to move, playing a terrifying game of cat and mouse. Suddenly, a sharp, loud pop like a branch snapping under immense pressure came from directly overhead. She looked up, unable to see anything past a massive trunk. Then, a shower of small dirt and bark fragments rained down onto her head and shoulders, dislodged from high up in the canopy. Whatever it was, it climbed the enormous tree silently and was now directly above her, ready to drop. That small shower of debris was the final, devastating trigger. Sarah didn't hesitate. She sprinted out from cover and continued her headlong dash toward the distant road. She didn't hear the dragging or the crying again. When she finally reached her truck, collapsing into the driver's seat, she looked back at the deep, ancient woods. She didn't see anything, but she knew the chilling truth. The sounds weren't just noises. They were calculated attempts to lead human beings into the darkest parts of the forest. The wilderness often uses sound to deceive or lure, but sometimes the sound is completely mechanical, starkly out of place, and deeply disturbing. This brings us to our third true account, involving two experienced backpackers, David and Jessica Clark, a married couple who were hiking a remote section of the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. They were 10 miles into their 4-day loop, enjoying the peaceful solitude of the temperate rainforest. It was the second night. They had set up a perfect campsite next to a clear, fast-running stream. The sound of the water and the distant wind were soothing, lulling them into a sense of deep relaxation. Around midnight, David woke abruptly. He couldn't pinpoint why, but the silence felt different, thicker, heavier. He nudged Jessica, whispering, "Did you hear that?" Jessica, groggy, whispered back that she hadn't. Just as she spoke, they both heard it. A distinct, rhythmic knock. It was a solid, hard sound, like a rock hitting another rock, or wood against wood, delivered with an almost industrial force. Knock, knock, knock. It was perfectly spaced, methodical, and chillingly regular. It sounded like it was coming from deep within the forest, about a quarter-mile away. Maybe it's a woodpecker? Jessica suggested weakly, trying to rationalize the deeply unsettling sound. David shook his head instantly. "No, this is too loud, too powerful. It sounds like someone is hitting a tree with a sledgehammer, not pecking." The rhythmic knocking continued for several minutes, always coming from the same direction. Always the same 3 distinct, heavy strikes. The sound had an unnerving sense of purpose. It didn't sound random. It sounded like a signal, or perhaps a form of territory marking. It felt like a warning shot fired in the dark, David later explained. Every 3-beat sequence resonated through the humid, cool air, reminding them they were far from help and completely vulnerable inside their thin tent fabric. They held each other tightly, their eyes wide open in the absolute darkness. Then, the direction of the knocking changed. After final knock, 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 near the stream, a new sequence began. Knock, knock, knock. But this set came from behind their tent, much closer, barely 50 yards away. The speed of the sound shift was impossible for a human being moving through dense underbrush. This sound, now right on their doorstep, solidified their fear. This was no ordinary animal or hiker. The sudden proximity of the knocking was paralyzing. David and Jessica huddled together, barely breathing, their senses strained to detect any movement outside the tent. The rhythmic strikes had stopped, leaving behind a silence far more frightening than the sound itself. They lay there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound to resume or for something far worse to happen. They could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on them. After nearly an hour of tense, agonizing silence, David decided they couldn't stay there. Waiting for dawn felt like waiting to be found. "We need to move. Now," he whispered to Jessica, reaching for their pre-packed emergency bags. They moved with silent precision, motivated by pure adrenaline, taking down the tent in coordinated, swift motions, their headlamps casting frantic, bouncing beams into the menacing dark. As they packed the last of their gear, Jessica, shining her light toward the dense brush where the final knocking sequence had originated, suddenly gasped. "Look, David, look at the mud," she whispered, her voice tight with suppressed fear. David quickly directed his own powerful beam toward the area she indicated, and what they saw made their stomachs churn. Pressed clearly into the damp, soft earth were large, circular indentations. They were deep, suggesting immense weight, and spaced unnaturally far apart, but they weren't footprints. They were small, smooth depressions, almost like the bottom of a narrow, heavy pole or instrument had been repeatedly pressed or struck in the ground right beside their camp. They seemed to trace a small, deliberate semicircle. The evidence indicated that whatever had made the knocking sound was stationary and incredibly heavy when it delivered the signal. It wasn't moving through the forest. It was standing there, methodically banging something, creating the precise rhythm they heard. The idea of a massive, heavy creature or entity silently observing and signaling so close to them in the dark was truly terrifying. Abandoning the rest of their planned route, David and Jessica immediately hiked out, moving quickly to the pre-dawn forest, guided only by the dim, rising light and their shared terror. They never heard the knocking sound again, but they both agreed on one thing. The noise wasn't a natural occurrence. It was a conscious, deliberate attempt to create a psychological effect, a warning that they were deep within a territory where humans were not welcome. Fear in the forest often comes from recognizing something that shouldn't be there, and nothing is more jarring than a sound that seems to come from an entirely different world. Our fourth story features Michael Thompson, a geologist mapping remote land in the high desert mountains of Nevada. Michael spent days alone, surrounded by arid landscapes, sharp rock formations, and a chilling, perpetual silence that amplified every tiny sound. Michael was meticulously checking mineral samples near a narrow canyon wall when the temperature dropped suddenly. Even though it was midday, a profound, unnatural stillness descended, silencing the few birds and insects that usually populated the area. He paused his work, instinctively looking around, his senses prickling. It felt like the environment itself was bracing for something awful, a pressure change before a catastrophic event. Then came the sound. It wasn't a growl, a snap, or a knock. It was a high-frequency screech, a noise so sharp and metallic it felt like thin wires were being scraped across his teeth. It wasn't loud, but its pitch was agonizingly precise, cutting through the silence and causing immediate, stabbing pain in his eardrums. He immediately clamped his hands over his ears, dropping his hammer in samples. The sound continued for about 30 seconds, maintaining the exact same frequency, devoid of any fluctuation, like a flawed, enormous machine running deep underground. It had no Doppler effect. It didn't seem to be coming from anywhere. It was just present in the air around him. When the screech finally stopped, Michael felt a profound sense of disorientation, a residual vibration in his bones, and a low-grade headache. Michael, trying to shake off the strange physical effects, attempted to rationalize the noise as equipment from a distant mine or even military aircraft testing. But the sound was far too specific, too raw, and too consistent to be anything man-made he was familiar with. It had a biological quality mixed with an industrial one, a truly impossible combination. He knew, with sudden certainty, that the sound was an inherent part of this place, not an external intrusion. He quickly packed his delicate equipment, deciding to abandon the site immediately. As he was strapping his gear onto his pack frame, he heard a quieter, but equally unnerving, follow-up sound. It was a rapid, clicking noise, like multiple tiny claws skittering across the dry, rocky canyon floor, approaching his location from two different directions. It was a clear indication that whatever produced the agonizing screech was now sending something else to investigate. The sound of the rapid, multi-directional clicking was enough to dissolve Michael's remaining composure. He knew he couldn't outrun something that could traverse the treacherous, rocky terrain so quickly and silently. He grabbed his satellite phone, intending to call for an emergency pickup, but immediately decided against it. Whatever was out there had shown a complex level of coordination, and he didn't want to draw more attention. He decided his best chance was to find a high, secure hiding spot. He scrambled up a small, jagged outcropping, wedging himself into a tight crevice between two large boulders. From this vantage point, he pulled out his binoculars and scanned the desert floor below, trying to pinpoint the source of the frantic clicking that continued to grow louder and closer, sounding less like claws and more like hard shell fragments striking rock. Peering down through the clear glass, he saw nothing moving on the open ground. The clicking, however, intensified, becoming almost deafeningly loud. He slowly lowered his gaze, focusing on the immediate area beneath his hiding spot. And then he saw it. Not large, terrifying creatures, but hundreds of small, black, hard-shell beetles of an unknown species, moving in perfect, organized formation. These beetles were enormous, the size of a human fist, and they were moving not randomly, but as a single, terrifying collective. Their hard exoskeletons hitting the gravel and rock created the loud, disturbing clicking noise. They swarmed the exact spot where Michael had dropped his gear, testing the ground, moving in synchronized, unsettling patterns, clearly searching for the source of the recent disturbance. The most unnerving part was their behavior around the location of the screech. When the beetles reached the canyon wall, they began climbing vertically, moving up the sheer rock face with impossible speed and coordination. Michael realized the piercing mechanical sound wasn't a warning, but perhaps a high-frequency call used to marshal these strange, searching organisms to a specific location, his location. He remained frozen in the crevice for 3 agonizing hours, watching the bizarre, clicking swarm conduct its precise investigation below. Finally, as the sun began to dip, the beetles stopped their search, and in an instant, they dispersed and disappeared back into the shadows of the rocks, leaving the oppressive, strange silence behind. Michael, profoundly disturbed by the organized, inhuman response to the sound, hiked the remaining 20 miles through the night, abandoning his entire research trip. Most unsettling forest sounds are singular: a scream, a crash, a knock. But what happens when the sounds combine, forming a distinct, complex pattern that sounds horrifyingly like a conversation? Our 5th story comes from Jennifer Hayes, a solo backpacker hiking in the dense, isolated forests of Oregon near the Cascade Mountain Range. She was fully prepared for harsh weather and wildlife, but not for the auditory anomaly that marked her 3rd night. Jennifer had chosen a small, secluded patch of old-growth forest for a campsite, surrounded by huge, silent fir trees. She was reading inside her tent, enjoying the quiet comfort of her space, when she heard the first sound. It was a low, rattling chirr like a disturbed animal, coming from about 50 yards to her left. She dismissed it as a nocturnal raccoon or porcupine. However, the chirr was immediately answered by a completely different sound, a deep, resonant hiss, coming from the opposite direction, about 70 yards to her right. It was a prolonged exhalation, powerful enough to rustle the lower ferns. The 2 sounds were distinct yet perfectly timed, creating a strange call and response pattern in the oppressive darkness. It sounded like an exchange. Jennifer pulled her knife and sat up straight. This was not the behavior of 2 random animals. The interaction was too precise, too measured. Then the sounds evolved. The chirr mixed with a series of sharp clicks, and the hiss was answered by a wet, rapid gurgling noise. It sounded utterly alien, yet the structure was undeniable. They were communicating, exchanging information in a dark, foreign language. The conversation intensified, moving around her tent in a slow, wide circle. The sounds varied wildly, from high, reedy whistles to low, shuddering roars, but the pattern never broke. It was a language. I swear it was, Jennifer stated, tearfully, in her police report filed days later. It had syntax. They were talking about something, and I knew, instinctively, that whatever they were discussing involved my presence. The terrifying, complex communication continued for almost 20 minutes, getting gradually closer until the separate noises were originating from barely 30 feet away, flanking her on both sides. Jennifer stayed motionless, her entire body locked by fear, barely daring to breathe. She realized she wasn't just hearing strange animal noises. She was a captive audience to a secret, disturbing discussion taking place right outside her thin shelter. The flanking conversation continued to move, closing the distance slowly, emphasizing the deliberate, predatory nature of the encounter. Jennifer realized that the sounds weren't meant to scare her off. They were meant to surround her, to confirm her location and coordinate a strategy. She clutched her satellite phone, desperately wishing she had a signal strong enough to call for help, but the dense, old-growth canopy blocked everything. Suddenly, the separate noises, the churring clicks and the hissing gurgles, stopped simultaneously. The forest fell into a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Jennifer pressed herself against the back wall of the tent, her eyes wide, waiting for the inevitable physical confrontation. Her mind raced, desperately trying to conjure up a defensive plan against the unseen communicators. Then came the final, devastating sound. It was a single, unified noise, delivered with overwhelming volume from just outside the tent door. It was a long, shuddering, drawn-out scream, combining the low resonance of the chirr with the sharp edge of the hiss, forming one single, ear-splitting noise that sounded like agony and triumph combined. It wasn't human, yet it conveyed a profound, shocking sense of malice. The force of sound made the tent fabric vibrate. Jennifer let out a choked cry, covering her ears, blinded by the sudden surge of terror. The scream was the finale of their dark conversation, a synchronized announcement of their awareness and capability. It lasted only a few seconds, but it seemed to tear apart the fabric of the night, confirming that she was utterly trapped. When the scream stopped, silence returned, permanent and final. Jennifer waited another hour, rigid with fear, before she dared to move. She knew the creatures were still out there, listening. As soon as the first hint of gray light appeared, she launched herself out of the tent, grabbing only her phone and water, leaving behind everything else, her food, her pack, her gear, as a desperate offering. Running blindly toward the nearest trail, she never heard the chawing or the gurgling again. When park rangers later recovered her abandoned campsite, they found deep, long scorch marks etched into the dirt around the perimeter of the tent, marks that defied any explanation, further validating her terrifying account of the calculated, chilling conversation she had barely survived. Not all disturbing forest sounds are guttural or mechanical. Some are horrifying because they sound human, but terribly corrupted. Our sixth story involves Mark Peterson, a volunteer search and rescue coordinator who was conducting a solo training exercise in a deeply remote, mountainous region of California, specifically known for unsolved missing persons cases. Mark was using a high-grade, long-range radio to test transmission reliability in deep canyons. It was late afternoon, and Mark was settled on a small rocky outcrop, methodically cycling through frequencies on his expensive military-spec receiver. Most channels were empty static or faint, distant weather reports. Then, as he swept through a lower frequency band, his receiver caught something unexpected. The distinct, fragmented sound of human voices and music, terribly distorted, like a very old AM broadcast. He locked the frequency, trying to clear the static. He could make out snippets of big band music, the type that hadn't been popular since the 1940s or 50s. More chillingly, beneath the music, he heard bursts of terrified human shouting. Not clear words, just raw, desperate screams and shouts that sounded like they were being transmitted through water. It was a cacophony of fear and dated music. Mark initially assumed he had intercepted a highly localized, historical broadcast trapped in an odd atmospheric duct, or perhaps a malfunctioning antique radio left in the cabin. But the terror in the voices was too raw, too immediate to be a recording. He felt an intense, crushing sadness emanating from the radio, a profound sense of human misery being echoed across the silent, imposing mountainside. He tried desperately to get a bearing on the signal, but the direction finder spun uselessly. The signal was strong, yet seemed to originate from everywhere at once, saturating the canyon walls. It felt like I was listening to a moment in time that was desperately trying to repeat itself. Mark recounted. The screams intensified, reaching a terrifying, synthesized peak before the entire broadcast abruptly cut out, leaving behind only the dead, heavy static. Shaken, Mark immediately packed up his equipment. The entire incident lasted less than 2 minutes, yet left a deep, cold certainty in his heart. He had briefly tapped into a traumatic event that had occurred in that canyon decades ago, a silent history now whispering through the airwaves. He drove away from the area that night, unable to shake the image of forgotten people, lost and screaming, perpetually trapped in the mountains. Our final, and perhaps most psychologically unnerving, account comes from Alex Reed, a young trail runner traversing a remote section of the Rockies in Colorado. Unlike the other noises, the knocks, the screams, the conversations, Alex heard a sound that was intrinsically connected to his actions. The sound of a phantom companion running directly behind him, yet always remaining unseen. It was a terrifying mirror of his own activity. Alex was about 12 miles into his run on a cold, sunny morning. The trail was narrow, winding through dense pine forest. He was in a zone, listening to his own rhythmic breathing and the soft thump-thump of his lightweight trail shoes on the packed dirt. He felt completely alone, enjoying the solitude of the strenuous effort. This feeling of control, however, was about to be violently shattered by an impossible intrusion. As he rounded a tight bend, focusing on his footing, he heard it. A distinct, lighter, but equally rhythmic thump-thump mirroring his own steps. It was directly behind him, maintaining his exact pace. The sound of someone running effortlessly in his slipstream. Alex instinctively checked his shoulder, expecting to see a fellow runner gaining on him. Perhaps someone he hadn't noticed approach. There was absolutely no one there. The trail was empty for hundreds of yards in both directions. Alex stopped dead, his own breathing ragged, and listened. Silence. The moment he stopped, the phantom footsteps stopped too. He felt an intense, sickening wave of paranoia wash over him. Was he hallucinating from exertion? He quickly decided to move again, needing to prove it was nothing. He started running, slow and steady. Thump, thump. Immediately, the matching, lighter thump-thump started right behind him. He sped up. The phantom steps sped up instantly, maintaining the exact, impossible distance. He tried stomping his feet hard. The steps behind him matched the impact with terrifying accuracy. It was like running with my own shadow, only the shadow was audible and terrifyingly real, Alex explained. The sound was always there, tracking his every stride, yet never gaining, never falling back. It was relentless, an unnerving proof that something was following him, mocking his every effort to escape. He knew that whatever was back there was deliberately creating the noise to mess with his head, to shatter his sense of safety and isolation. The game had begun, and he was the unwilling, terrified player. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs, not just from the intense physical exertion, but from the raw terror of the phantom pursuit. He tried to trick the noise, abruptly lunging off the trail into brush, then immediately scrambling back onto the path. When he landed back on the dirt, the corresponding thump-thump was right there, too fast, too efficient to be anything struggling through the undergrowth. The relentless, mirroring sound created a state of complete mental breakdown. He started yelling, shouting curses and commands into the empty air, demanding the invisible stalker to show itself. His shouts were met with silence, but the moment he started running again, the light, mocking footsteps instantly resumed their pace, right on his heels. This wasn't a warning. It was pure, cruel psychological torture. Driven by panic, Alex pushed his body past its breaking point, sprinting down a steep decline, ignoring the danger of twisting an ankle. He heard the following footsteps accelerate, too, maintaining the perfect, agonizing proximity. He looked back one last time and noticed a strange, shimmering distortion in the air a few feet behind him, a slight blurring of the forest behind where the steps sounded. That distortion was a final, terrifying piece of evidence. It wasn't just auditory. It had a visual component, confirming that something unnatural was creating this pursuit. Alex found a reserve of strength he didn't know he had and burst out onto the main Forest Service road, finally seeing a clear path to safety. He crossed the asphalt and collapsed onto the roadside gravel, gasping for air. He lay there for a minute, completely spent. Then he listened. For the first time in 10 miles, the echoing thump-thump was gone. The only sound was the distant drone of an engine and the rustle of dry leaves. He slowly stood, his legs trembling, and looked back at the tree line. The forest was silent, immense, and seemingly innocent, but he knew its secrets now. Alex never ran that trail again. The experience left him with chronic anxiety and a chilling, profound certainty. The forest is not always silent. Sometimes it speaks, it screams, it mimics, and sometimes it simply follows, reminding you that in the deepest wilderness, you're never truly alone, and the sounds you hear might be the last sounds you ever recognize as normal. We have navigated through 7 separate, horrifying true accounts, from the heavy, circling footsteps of Ethan to the calculated mimicry of Sarah, the industrial knocking face by David and Jessica, and the alien screech Michael heard. These stories share a frightening commonality. The noises were deliberate, intelligent, and designed to generate extreme fear and disorientation in the listener. They were psychological attacks, shattering the hiker's perceptions of safety. The forest, often seen as a place of peaceful escape, becomes something far darker in these accounts. It transforms into an environment where the laws of nature seem to bend, where things that should not speak do, and where sounds that defy explanation are used as tools of pursuit and manipulation. The most disturbing thought isn't what these things are, but how long they've been using sound to control and terrorize humans. Think about it. A rhythmic, impossible knocking that shifts direction instantly. A language made of clicks and gurgles discussing a human target. Or the terrifying high-frequency screech that calls forth organized, unnatural investigators. These aren't the sounds of simple bears or coyotes. These are the audio signatures of something far more complex, hidden just beyond the edges of human comprehension. What truly makes these stories terrifying is the lack of a final, clear answer. None of the hikers saw the entity that produced the noise, only the chilling evidence it left behind. The high scratches, the circular mud prints, the fire-like scorch marks. They only experienced the devastating psychological effect of the sound itself, an auditory confirmation that they had strayed into a place they did not belong. The wilderness holds an incredible capacity for silence, but when that silence is broken by an unnatural sound, it often marks the start of a fight for survival. When you step onto that solitary trail, remember these accounts. Remember the desperate flight of Ethan and the relentless, phantom footsteps pursuing Alex. Carry the fear with you, because sometimes being alert to the subtle differences in noise is the only thing that saves your life. Have you ever heard a sound in the woods that defied all logic? A whisper in the empty air, or a signal that chilled you to the bone? Share your true, terrifying stories in the comments below. Like and subscribe if these 7 accounts made the hair stand up on your arms. And don't forget to hit the notification bell. We'll be waiting here, listening for the next terrifying noise from the deep, dark forest.